Now, if you have a Bible with you, I'll give you the heads up now. You can turn to Psalm 32. It's in Psalm 32 that we'll be digging in today. But before we do that, I want to set it up this way. 28 years ago, a website was launched by a man named Pierre Omidyar. And this website was called Auction Web, and it was launched based on a computer code that he had created years ago in his home. And on this particular computer code, he had developed a method in which sellers and buyers could do business with one another, create a marketplace with one another. And what would happen is that as he would launch this, it would begin to gain a little bit of traction, but it had a little bit of a shaky start at the beginning too. In that the first item that was sold on Auction Web was a broken laser pointer. And so Pierre finds out about this, and he realizes that he doesn't want this new potential business of his to get a bad review early on. And so he reaches out to the purchaser of this broken laser pointer, and he says, "Sir, I'm so sorry. I know you want a laser pointer, but you purchased a broken one. We will send you one completely free of charge. We just wanted to make you aware that we are aware of this issue." And the man said, No, you don't understand. I'm actually a collector of broken laser pointers. And so I went to your website in order to do that. Now, Auction Web, in spite of that bit of a shaky beginning, as I said, it would actually do very well. And 3 years later, it would change its name to eBay, offer an IPO, and within 24 hours, Pierre Omidyar would become a billionaire overnight. And it was a space in which fair and somewhat reasonable purchases and selling could happen amongst people and create this great marketplace for that to happen. And so people would go on there and they would buy things that are new or somewhat new to them for a few less dollars. Wouldn't it be nice if everything that we need or wanted is something that we could just go to an eBay or an Amazon even and just purchase? And I'm not talking about the stuff that we have. I'm not talking about the clothes that we wear. I'm talking more about peace of mind. Wouldn't it be amazing after this time that we have together, you could leave and you could go buy a mind that isn't foggy anymore, distracted, but focused, and a mind that remembers? Wouldn't it be great if you could go purchase a clear conscience instead of a conscience that's full of guilt and shame of decisions that you've made? Wouldn't it be nice if you could purchase some new emotions? Because you've got emotions, but they just seem like they're the wrong ones most of the time. We can often be like that girl, the little girl in the Pixar movie Inside Out, who if you haven't seen the movie, it's at this very critical juncture in which she's about to lose all of her healthy emotions, because the synopsis of the movie is about how emotions are affecting and guiding this girl. And so she comes to this critical juncture in her life in which she's about to lose all of her healthy emotions. And the unhealthy, and you might say, the ones that can become unhealthy are about to take over and consume her. But then she's able to find her way, and that doesn't happen. But for many of us, maybe even for you, that moment wasn't able to get pulled back. And you wish that you could have feelings of love and of joy and of peace. But the feelings that often consume you are dissatisfaction and bitterness and anger. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just go and purchase something like that? That clear conscience, those healthy emotions, that mind that is focused and attentive to whatever the Lord would have. It's just not one of those things that's in the bag for us, it seems like. We want that, we desire that, but we don't know exactly how to get it. And that is the journey that we are going to be on these next few moments. Because what it is that we so often desire is found in a connection with the Lord. The Bible calls it a new heart. You see, everything I just described, our emotions, our mind, our conscience, all of that is wrapped up into our heart. And with the connection, a reconnection even for some of us to God, we can get that. We can have that. But it'll never be found on our own. And so we're studying the Psalms. And today we're looking at Psalm 32 again. And this is what's known as a penitent psalm. It's a psalm that is written by, these are psalms that are written by psalmists who come into an experience with God. And in light of his goodness, in light of his holiness, they realize how sinful they are. And so Psalm 6, Psalm 32, Psalm 38, Psalm 51, Psalm 102, Psalm 130, Psalm 143 are all these psalms that are written based on the writer's sensitivity to their sinfulness, sensitivity to the conviction that is upon them. You have two convictions that you will deal with in life, that I deal with. We have two. And how we respond to those two convictions will determine our lives, I think. I believe. You have the conviction of the world and the conviction of God. The world will convict you and it will tell you that you don't have enough of something. It will convict you and it will tell you that you need to experience more of something. It will convict you and tell you that you are too selfless and you need to be more selfish. Whereas the conviction of God will tell you that you need to be more focused on Him. That more shouldn't be the goal because more can just become the God. That it isn't about you. It should be about others and about Him. This is how we might say it. The conviction of God is about you discovering Him as opposed to just discovering yourself. The conviction of God is about looking to Him when you need help and not looking just within when you really need help. The conviction of God is about a greater care for others, not a furthering along of one's career as the conviction of the world would tell you. The conviction of God would say you need more holiness in your life, not more happiness as the world would tell you. The conviction of God will tell you that you need more spiritual intimacy. The conviction of the world will tell you you need more sexual intimacy. The conviction of the world will tell you that you need to give to others. The conviction of God will tell you need to give to others. The conviction of the world will tell you need to gain for yourself. You see what I'm saying? And when we give way to the conviction of the world, we end up in a path that's going to bring us to a place where, well, maybe that's where you're at, where you need to reconnect with God because your mind isn't focused, your emotions are a bit unhealthy, and your conscience is way too burdened. And so this is the moment where maybe you check out. Or maybe it's when you can really lean in and check in. Because this is a journey that we all need to take if we're going to leave here in a better place than we came. It's a place that David found himself in. That really prompted the writing of Psalm 51 and then Psalm 32. We think Psalm 32 came after 51. Why did he write Psalm 32? It's because of what happened in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 to know the specifics, the facts of what's going on around David. He should have gone off to fight in war. That was his responsibility. But he neglected his responsibility. Why? Because, well, he already bore too many scars from war. He was older. He was tired. He was established. He was entitled. He was a king. And when you're a king in that day, a king gets what he wants. And he saw something that he wanted. He saw someone that he wanted. Bathsheba. And so he took Bathsheba. Unfortunately, shortly after that, she would be found, after their infidelity, she would be found to be pregnant with a child. Rather than coming clean and owning up to his mistake, as God had been teaching him all the days of David's life, you know what he does? He manipulates. He connives. He sends Uriah to the front of the lines of battle, pulls the rest of his reinforcements back, and it's there that Uriah loses his life. So David is now an adulterer and a murderer. A year would go by. It would seem as though nothing's going to happen to David. It would seem as though nothing would come of what it is that he'd done. You know people like that. It just never seems like anything happens to them. Even in spite of all of the bad and the manipulating and different scheming that they do, nothing was coming of it all. But then a word of the Lord came to David from Nathan the prophet. Maybe a word of the Lord's coming to you today. It came to me as I was preparing this. The word of the Lord came to David through Nathan, and Nathan said, God knows what you did. You know you shouldn't have done it, and you're going to pay for it. And you've had a lot of time to deal with this, and you haven't dealt with it. And David, in that moment, his spirit was broken. And shortly after that, you would see the writing of Psalm 51. And so that's the context, that's the facts of 2 Samuel 11, the facts of David's situation. But Psalm 32, it tells us what's happening in his heart. It talks to us about the journey that he goes on as he's going to reconnect with the Lord, as he's going to come into a right relationship. He's going to come to peace with God. And that is not something that you or I can ever purchase. And so we come into Psalm 32. And the best way to understand Psalm 32 is like a 4-act play. And the 4-act play is this. The first few verses are David speaking to an audience. The next couple of verses is David speaking to God. The third act is God speaking to David, and the fourth act is David speaking again to the audience. And as this is taking place, there is one word that we connect with each one of those acts, and that's the journey. That's the most important journey that you'll ever go on. And it's this journey that can truly change your life. And you have a choice, and I have a choice. Is the conviction of this world going to guide us and define us? Maybe even destroy us? Or are you going to allow the conviction of God to save you? And so we begin in verse 1 of Psalm 32. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. He speaks of the pain that was going on inside of him, the misery of the sin that he had committed coming to fruition. And that's the key word here in the opening act, is sin. It's just hard for us to completely fathom the impact of sin on our lives, the impact of sin on other people's lives. Sin is so insidious. We acknowledge that the significance of a murder. We acknowledge the significance of even infidelity. We acknowledge the significance of embezzlement. But it's hard for us to make that same correlation with maybe a thought that we have that we shouldn't have. Maybe a little lie that we tell that we shouldn't tell. But it's all the same. All of it is disconnecting us from God. All of it is taking us to a place where we just want to justify. I like this quote. You've probably heard it, at least some of you. Just to give us some concept of sin. Sin will take us further than we want to go. Sin will take us further than we want to go. We may just want to think about it, but those thoughts, they eventually do affect our actions. I mean, it can be as simple as, I'm just going about, this is just, simple, silly, whatever. 7 o'clock, you sit down, you're just going to eat a few chips. 9 p.m., you've already consumed 2,000 calories. It's small, but it grows. It's a thought. And then all of a sudden, it's a consideration, it's a temptation, it's a conversation. You didn't think it was going to go that far with that other person, but then somehow you're trying to reel it back in. Maybe you haven't crossed the lines of a full-blown affair, but it's close. It'll take you further than you want to go. It'll keep you longer than you want to stay. You just wanted to have a little thought. You were just teasing out your anger, but you didn't realize how much resentment and bitterness that teasing out would create after a year or two of continuing to foster those thoughts. It'll cost you more than you want to pay. Man, people have lost families. They've lost careers. They've lost years of their lives. Man, what a statement. I mean, what a spiritual giant that had to come up with something like that, you know? I mean, you really got to spend some time with the Lord to come up with a statement like that. I mean, that's the kind of person that if you come up with something like that, you wouldn't think that kind of sin would consume them. I did a little research. I was just curious. It's such a common statement about sin and description of sin. Who in the world could have said this? If I'm going to say something to you, I'd like to know who said it first. And I did a little research, and the name, it's been used a lot, but the name that came up the most was a man named Ravi Zacharias. Considered by many to be a spiritual giant, a man that he knew the ins and outs of the Christian faith. He was easily one of the greatest Christian apologists to ever live. And yet, in spite of everything he knew, even in spite of the wisdom of a statement like this about sin, it is that same sin that just destroyed his legacy. I don't know if God spared him or not. He died, and shortly after that, all of his all of the infidelity that was in his life, the sexual immorality began to come out, and his entire ministry was destroyed. His family, the lives of his family were affected. It was terrible. None of us are immune to sin. Even somebody like Ravi, who was seemingly a spiritual giant. He wasn't immune to it. You're not immune to it. I'm not immune to it. I was just thinking about that sin. You know, I've had moments where I'll let something get the best of me. I was just thinking it comes in all shapes and sizes. You got to know that. And I haven't ever committed an affair, but I've had lustful thoughts. I've never drank so much alcohol that I just threw up and passed out and was stumbling around or got a DUI or any of that. But not long ago I had 2 beers. And I realized that and it was after the fact, I hadn't eaten any food, and it really affected me. I was impaired. And I thought, I've crossed the line here. I shouldn't have gone here. I don't do that often. I rarely ever take a drink of any kind. And yeah, I've never abused any of my kids, but I've gotten angry at them, way too angry and upset. I've never committed perjury. But I was talking to somebody just the other day about a basketball game that I was coaching, and you know what? We lost by 9, but I was like, I think we lost by 5 or 6. Man, we all fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't start with us. It starts with His goodness and where He is, with His holiness. And then when we come into that, we realize, wow, we have really fallen short. And here's the last little piece of this. I know many of you have not gone off of the deep end with some of these things. What do you do with the small stuff, though? Or even the big stuff, for that matter? Are you justifying it? Or are you trying to really be forgiven for it? If you justify it, the lies, the lust, the anger, the jealousy, the bitterness, the discontent, if you justify it, that's the conviction of the world. And you will be so connected to this world if you do that. That's what all the world's bonding around. But if you can acknowledge it for what it is, then in that moment, you aren't connecting to the world, but now, like all of us need to, we get to reconnect with God. And so David is taking us on this journey again. And he says, "For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave me the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place, God. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with the songs of deliverance." He's coming to God with a confession, not a justification. He's coming to God appealing for grace, not appealing for things. Friends, God has such a desire to forgive. So much of a desire to forgive that far, far, far outweighs our desire to confess. A few weeks ago, we had a time of prayer in church, and we were hopeful that some of you would take some time to confess, to reconnect with the Lord. I don't know if there's a day that goes by that we shouldn't be confessing something to God. It's in that confession that we get to receive His mercy and His grace. You have concerns, though, right? You have worries. You got kid things, marriage things, money things, career things, health things, head things, heart things. So we got all kinds of things. We're not short on things that we want God to intersect in and do something about and help us with and give us wisdom, right? I mean, every single day it seems like we're praying for wisdom. I know you are. You want to make the right choice. It's great. But maybe before we get to all that, we just need that grace. We need to confess to get ourselves that mercy to get right with Him. It's kind of like this. My family, we just moved, and we were fortunate enough. We were moved out of the area of the church in Highlands Ranch out to the south side of Sedalia, and you know how it is. In the process of unpacking, it's hard to find things, and so I needed a lighter, and so I went over to my neighbor, great guy, and I said, "Hey, I'm sorry, can I borrow a lighter?" And he's like, "Oh yeah." He had like a box of them or something. He said, "Here's a lighter. You can just take it," and that was really nice of him, and it was good because our relationship, him and I mean, we just met. I haven't done anything to make him mad yet, so we're good. We're in a good place. But imagine if I were walking up his driveway to ask for that lighter, and on the way up, he had this little dog, this little yipper, and you know how they are. They're small, but they think they're mighty. And so this thing's coming at me, and he's like nipping at me and nipping at me and nipping at me. Maybe you've experienced this with a dog before. It's weird how the little ones do that, and so it's nipping. I kind of look around, I don't see anybody, and then I just give it a good swift, wha-cha! You know, one of those little karate kid, dang, and the dog just runs off, yip, 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 yip. And then I look up, and I see my neighbor. He saw the whole thing. Hypothetical. But imagine he saw that. Now, is that a good time for me to go and ask him for a lighter? Or do I got some things that him and I need to get sorted out before I make some type of an appeal of him? We need to be willing to come before the Lord and get ourselves right with Him. That's where prosperity really is. It's not in the things of this world. And that's maybe what we struggle with. We see the people in this world that are, man, they have all the stuff. They have all the things. They seem to have it all together. They've got all this prosperity, but there's so much that we don't know. Proverbs 28:13 tells it to us like this. It says, "Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper." What? But we've seen so many who have, but it's not about a financial or a physical prosperity. It's about a spiritual one. But the one who confesses and renounces them, those sins finds mercy. And we're back to that place. Are you going to check out or are you going to lean in? Because this is the moment when your heart can really get to the place, like the whole of your heart. Jeremiah says you can get a whole new heart, a new mind, a new conscience, everything. This is a chance for you. Psalm 95. Today, if only you would hear His voice, don't harden your heart. You lay it all out to Him. And again, God desires so much more to forgive than we desire to confess. But maybe in this moment you can confess. And David continues, "I will instruct you," and this is God actually speaking to David, "and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. Do not let the horse or the mule, do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding." He says, David, don't be an animal again that's just impulsive. Don't be that beast that you were when you saw Bathsheba, that just went after that thing that he desired. Don't be that anymore. Be my child. Be the king that I appointed you to be. Be the man that I made you to be in my image. Don't be like a horse or a mule that must be controlled by a bit and bridle, or they won't come to you. He's like, I don't want to force you to come to me. I don't want to lasso you and just pull you in. I want to forgive you. That's the word that we have here. It's forgiveness. And in that forgiveness, There is instruction. It's that breaking. It's that conviction that God has for us. It's that instruction. And he'll teach you out of that the way that you should go. The forgiveness of God is tough. Man, it's such a tension, isn't it? Like, how does God, who is good and holy and just, become merciful and forgiving for all of our shortcomings? Like, doesn't it seem like in forgiving us that he compromises his holiness? Think about that. I mean, that's some of the significance of forgiveness, is that he's in essence compromising his holiness. How does he reconcile that? How does all that happen? Well, because all we've heard about is what's said in Exodus 34. This is the riddle of the Old Testament right here, Exodus 34. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. You get that. That's probably about all that's been preached. 90% of what has been preached, it feels like, in the church in the last 40 years is God is loving and he's compassionate and he's slow to anger, and he is all of those things. Maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the third and the fourth generation. Whoa. Doesn't that last part seemingly eliminate the first part? How is all of this going to get figured out? How does all of this get reconciled? You have to understand that. I have to understand that, or we don't get forgiveness. We don't really get the grace of God. It's this unfolding, this gradual revelation that you have in the Scriptures. Moses' sacrificial, it really starts with Adam and Eve. And there had to be death for their sin. It was the death of the animals that they would ultimately be clothed by. But then you have the sacrificial system that Moses establishes. It was David talking about the joy of his salvation in Psalm 51. He knew there was salvation. He just didn't understand it, how it was all going to work out. Like I said, it's hard to figure out. It's Isaiah 53 saying there's a servant who would take on the sin and the sorrow of the world. What? Who is this servant? And then on the cross of Calvary, Jesus. It's at Jesus that you see God's justice and his wrath poured out. But yet we also see his love and his grace and his compassion given. That's what took him there. That's what held him there. And so now we can reconcile forgiveness because we have a cross. And we have hope because of an empty tomb. But we have to choose to forgive that. Or we have to choose to receive that forgiveness. In 1830, it's one of my favorite stories. It's a bit tragic, but it definitely teaches the point. Two men named George Wilson and James Porter robbed a mail carrier in Pennsylvania. Shortly after that, they were caught. And in that day and time, that was a capital offense. And so they were both sentenced to death. Shortly after that, James Porter was hung. But George Wilson had some very influential friends who were connected to Andrew Jackson, the president of the day. They appealed to Andrew Jackson. They said he didn't know what he was doing. He'd lost his way, and so a pardon was given. But George Wilson didn't want to receive the pardon. He didn't receive the pardon. He rejected it. All he had to do was stay a few more years in the prison, and everything would have been wiped clean from his record. But he wouldn't receive the pardon, this thing that would have made him free. And the court didn't know what to do with it. So it went up through the court system and ultimately landed with the Supreme Court, where the famous Chief Justice John Marshall resided. And after hearing the details of the case, John Marshall gave this conclusion: a pardon is a deed to the validity of which delivery is essential, and the delivery is not completed without acceptance. It may then be rejected by the person to whom it is tendered, and if it be rejected, we have discovered no power in a court to force it on him. And so George Wilson committed a crime, was given a pardon, rejected the pardon, and was ultimately executed because of it. I mean, how unbelievable. He had a new lease on life. He had forgiveness that was given to him, grace that was given to him, mercy that was given to him. And he rejected it. He rejected it. And that is what God is presenting to you today. It's this opportunity that you don't have to buy because it's already been purchased for you on a cross at Calvary. It's just this acknowledgement as I'm not going to be looking within myself. I'm just going to look to God and realize, oh yeah, I've fallen short. I need your grace. So I'm going to confess everything that I've fallen short with, at least the best of my knowledge. And then this amazing thing happens. There's change. David speaks of that, these last few verses, as he talks to his audience again. Many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad. Because you've sinned, you've confessed, but you've been forgiven. And now you are going to change because you're not going to rejoice and be glad in all the things of the world because that's not what's breaking you anymore. What's going to break you is the things of God. And so you're going to rejoice and be glad in the Lord because you are righteous. And you will sing, all you who are upright in heart. And this is the opportunity that is before you. As David speaks to this audience, the key word there is change. You can change. But it's not because you do it, it's because God will do it to you as you take this kind of journey that we've just been on. And it can happen right now. Despite how foggy your mind may be, despite how heavy your conscience is, even despite how distorted your emotions are, God is giving you a new heart and a new path if I would so choose to pursue it. It's that simple. It's that easy. And we've got a life ahead of us to enjoy with it. But think of all the people that just keep putting it off. Maybe that's even been you. For that initial connection to God or that reconnection with God, just keep putting it off. Put it off. Next week I'll do it. Next month I'll make that right. Today is the day of salvation. That idea brings me to a man named Luke Short, who I just heard about this past week. He was 100 years old, walking through his New England field that he had worked so hard to acquire. And in the midst of this field, as he considered the unusual vigor that he had and the life that was still in him, he recalled a sermon that he had heard 85 years prior. At the age of 15, his parents made him go to church. And it was there that he heard a message about sin, confession, forgiveness, change. And he realized that he had no peace with God. He had a lot of things of the world, but he didn't have any peace with God. And in that moment, the despair of having no hope in eternity grabbed a hold of him. And he recalled that word that had been spoken so many years before. And he made his peace with God. What a great story as you consider the promises of God. That his word never returns void, as we see in this man's life. If you raise your child up in the Lord, there may be a gap, but at some point we are assured, we are promised that there is this opportunity for that individual to come back to the Lord. When they're older, they will not depart from it. But what a waste. 85 years it took him to get the moment that you get right now. To acknowledge that you've fallen short, to confess it, to receive his forgiveness, and to change. You may not live to be 100. You may not have that moment. God's word has promised it won't return void. I cling to it every time I walk up here. And I just cling to the fact and hope and pray that you are leaning in and not checking out. Now is your opportunity for that new heart and that new path, if you would so choose it. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, and the new is here. And maybe you're ready to make that kind of a decision. maybe you need to respond. Maybe you need to make peace with God now. And that is something that you don't have to buy because it's already been bought and purchased for you on Calvary. I'll be available just outside the room in our Next Steps room, outside this doors, and I would love to talk to you about that decision if you want to make it, or that peace if you need it. Here is the opportunity for you if you should so choose it. Don't put it off. Today is the day of salvation. Let's pray. Father, so grateful for what you've given us in Christ. And the riddle that is this world and the riddle that is just a relationship with you, we're so grateful that it's resolved at Calvary. We've all fallen short of your glory, Lord, and we confess those shortcomings and those sins to you now. And we plead for your forgiveness and your mercy and your compassion to come upon us. And may today be the day of salvation. Today is the day of connecting with you, reconnecting with you, that makes us, takes us, changes us. In the name of Christ, amen.